Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Social Medicine Course podcast from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine up in the Bronx in New York City. My name is Brett Wilson-Stofko. I'm one of the lead organizers of the course, and I'll be your host. Today, our talk will be given by Dr. Sunil Agarwal, a resident physician at the NYU Rusk Institute of Rehabilitation Medicine and Vice Chair of New York Physicians for Compassionate Care. He will be speaking on the history and medical use of cannabis and the state of medical cannabis and legalization in New York. So, without further ado, Dr. Sunil Agarwal.
So, thanks again for coming today, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here at Einstein because actually one of the places I wanted to do my internship for medicine was at Monty, and I had interviewed there a number of years ago, and I was just so excited by the history of the social medicine here, the history of the takeover of Lincoln Hospital, which is one of the talks that you have a few from now, which is I was telling Rachel about. Like, there's a book about that called White Coat Clenched Fist that one of my PhD advisors had recommended that I read. It's by Fitzhugh Mullah, and it's like kind of the beginning of the community medicine in the South Bronx, and it all started in this system, and then the first pay and free wards were in the hospitals at Montefiore. The first female attendings in hospitals were at Montefiore. I mean, just a lot of stuff that was cutting edge and pioneer for its day. So it's really great to, though I didn't end up at Montefiore, to be here with you guys today. So what I'm talking today about, the topic is medical cannabis and whether we could get that a law or some kind of system or accommodation in New York State. Now, I'm not using the word marijuana because it's not a scientific term. It's like if you told all your patients that when you prescribe them morphine, you'd be giving them smack or something like that, or when you put your kid on mixed amphetamine salts, this is the Breaking Bad stuff, or something like that. It's the difference between slang and kind of scientific botanical terminology when it comes to using substances in a medical context. And as all of the substances I mentioned both have all these other contexts around them, and that's just the history of humans and substances. But when we want to talk about them in a medical setting, it's best to try and use our science terms because it kind of helps you to think about the topic in a more holistic and less biased, maybe less stigmatized, less glamorized, and all the things that attend. That's just language, and there's all these fights we've had over language in society, reclaiming words in different social groups. You know what I'm talking about. I don't mean to be politically correct. Marijuana is the legal term in American law and in New York law. So I'll explain why I want to talk about cannabis also from the scientific standpoint, because the cannabinoid signaling system. And this is something that should be taught in medical school curricula, but is not being taught enough. Any of your first or second year lecturers discuss the endocannabinoid signaling system? Just a couple of head shakes. Did they say that it was the most active neurotransmitter in the brain on a per second basis? Did they say they were 10 times more prevalent than opioid receptors? No, nobody said that. Okay. That's the kind of thing I'm saying. Like, they'll mention it in passing as sort of like okay, this is something that we kind of just discovered, has some interesting applications, we think, maybe down the road. But it turns out this system is actually widespread throughout the brain and nervous system. If I had done my slide talk, I would show you all these slides. But so let me try to put it this way. The endocannabinoid signaling system is 600 million years old in biology. It first appeared when essentially it was a solution for multicellular organisms to do cell-to-cell communication. It's very basic, very elementary. The Hydra and the Sea Squirt all have these cannabinoid signaling systems, and then all throughout all mammalian cell lines. The only things that didn't develop were non-deuterostomes, like insects, like the things that weren't butt first, if you remember your biology, evolutionary biology. So endocannabinoid signaling system isn't there, but in every other form of life, not in plants, but I'm talking about the certain lineages. They're called deuterostomes, so you can look that up. Anyway, so it turns out that systems got more complex and developed nervous systems, there was a need to figure out a way to signal back from instead of like just neuron A sending a signal to neuron B, open this channel, transmit this signal to the central nervous system. Now there's a question of like, well, there's too many signal inputs coming to one cell and it's just getting overwhelmed, or there's not enough signaling going on. How does that cell go back and communicate to the presynaptic cell? That's one of the solutions that the endocannabinoid signaling system served for biology, for animals, for life. So retrograde signaling for modulating neuronal excitability. That's what I'm talking about. That's pretty basic and fundamental to neurobiology. But it turns out that cannabinoid signaling isn't just used in neurological tissues. You also find it in immune tissues. Your T helper 1, T helper 2 cells, macrophages, they're involved in cytokine, like tamping down excessive cytokine release. So it's also involved in inflammation. And I could go on. They're in the spleen, they're in the liver, they're in the reproductive system. Rachel mentioned that she was studying feeding it before she got to medical school in infants. It turns out that if you block cannabinoid receptors in mice, they end up failing to thrive. They don't have a suckling response. So there's something regarding like the appetitive desire to take in food that the cannabinoid signaling system is tied into. So all of this research has been done really since the early 90s. We didn't really know, and all of it was stimulated because people were trying to understand how does marijuana, cannabis, work in the brain. For a long time people thought, okay, it was just this sort of non-specific binding, that it would go into cell membranes like just to dissolve into the lipid and just kind of move around the cell membrane. But then in 1988, they at University of at Washington State, WashU in St. Louis, they discovered the CB1 receptor. And that kind of changed everything. Like, oh, okay, there's a specific receptor. And then they found out, oh, okay, there's another receptor in these immune cells. And then they found out, wow, there's actually endogenous molecules that cells are making to bind to those receptors. And then they found out there's enzymes to make those molecules, and on and on and on and on. So it's this huge explosion, and you could just look at PubMed, and like the graph of literature is just thousands and thousands of articles. And the reason why we're not being taught about this and it's not there is because our education system is very much driven by, okay, what are the drugs that are available for us to treat patients, and who's going to pay for that curriculum development and all that stuff. And it's an unfortunate fact, but I think studying this system will give you a better understanding of health, because you'll kind of see the relationship between the neuronal system and the immune system, and you'll understand like diseases that we don't have a good grasp on, like inflammatory bowel disease, MS, and fibromyalgia, and even cancers. A lot of things that we didn't really have a good understanding of. The cannabinoid system is shedding light on disease processes. So it's a very fundamental thing, and another sort of social justice issue is that we're not being taught these things because of the politics around marijuana. So that's something that's where I want to start this. Okay, so 600 million years ago, cannabinoid signaling evolved. About 1 million years ago, 2 million, whatever, humans showed up on the planet, on the scene, and as far back as we have pre-recorded history, even before recorded history, archaeological evidence, it seems to indicate that humans cultivated and domesticated the cannabis plant. It's just something that humans did. We have old shamans, mummy remains in China from like 2700 BC that shows like fresh cannabis there. People actually like looked at it on a microscope, and there's like pottery with the cannabis stalk was used for twine and fiber as early as 3000 BC, and then that's in Taiwan in the indigenous people there. And there's references in the Ebers Papyrus, which is like one of the oldest medical texts known to humanity, which was from Egypt. And a copy of that was actually at the New York Academy of Medicine for a long time. So this is like a big old historic thing. So humans had figured out to use this plant, and it makes sense because what's the plant's history now? That plant is 37 million years old, and it probably evolved somewhere in like China, India, like in the Himalayas region, maybe in Central Asia. We don't exactly know, but that region, and it basically is a wind-pollinated dioecious plant. That means there's male and female, and sometimes there's hermaphrodites as well. But it's a wind-pollinated plant. The males send their pollen to the females. The females produce resinous flowers. The resin allows the pollen to stick, and that's how fertilization occurs and the circle of life continues. But the resin that the plant's flowers secrete is rich in phytocannabinoids. And those are what bind to and stimulate the endocannabinoid system in the mammals, in the humans. Why is the plant making these? Well, we don't, nobody can ask the plant, but it seems based on geographic studies that it serves the purpose of ultraviolet light protection. UV damage is going to ruin your DNA, so you got to figure out a way to absorb that and reduce the impact on your genome. And so cannabis came up with this solution. There's also potentially warding off of insects, and who knows, maybe there's a coevolutionary relationship that it's selected, because what have humans done with the cannabis plant? Because they like it, because it interacts with their endogenous systems of mood, appetite, memory, and I'll mention a few others. Well, they just moved it all over the world. It's in every country in the world now. Think about that. One plant starts in the middle of Afghanistan or foothills of the Himalayas, and now you find it in every country in the world. So, that's what Michael Pollan calls a plant's eye view of the world. If there's a book called The Botany of Desire, he used to write for New York Harper's Magazine, and he wrote this book there's a really great chapter on cannabis, human-cannabis relationship. So this is like another way of thinking about plant drugs, where it's just beyond sort of, okay, what's the glossy, where can I buy it, and coffee shops and everything, and look into actually what are humans in this plant been doing? What's the relationship between the two? And it seems that there's a co-evolutionary relationship. It seems that there's a very long-standing historical relationship. So what happened was this plant was integrated into numerous pharmacopoeias around the world, in Indian medicine, Chinese medicine, Tibi medicine, Middle Eastern medicine, as I mentioned, Egyptian medicine, when did the West, our medical schools come out of the Flexner Report and all the Western medical advances, microbiology and all that. So when did the West come into contact with this formally? About 1830, 1820, somewhere in there. And that was when an Irish doctor by the name of William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, who was a graduate of the University of Edinburgh Medical School, which was one of the top medical schools in the mid-19th century, early 19th century, he was like in medical school, like you guys. He actually discovered the treatment for cholera, like as a medical student. And not the antibiotic that we treat. We didn't know about that then. But how else would you treat cholera if you didn't have antibiotics? Anybody? Electrolytes. That's right, electrolytes. Somebody said electrolytes. He did IV hydration with electrolytes, and that saved many, many lives, because you're not going to die of like dehydration from your profuse diarrhea. And this is what he came up with as a medical student, and I guess it impressed somebody after he graduated, and they're like, okay, we're going to post you in the heart of our British Empire. You're going to go to India, you're going to go to Calcutta, and good luck. So what did he do there? He started a medical school, the Medical College of Calcutta. One of several professors, and it was the first modern medical school in Asia. And while he was there, he decided to study what the indigenous practitioners were doing there, because he says, we don't know everything. He's this curious guy from Ireland, and he really just met with local fakirs and medicine men, indigenous practices, and that's when he kind of stumbled on this use of cannabis. And he was like, okay, this is kind of interesting. It seems like it's involved in the social customs here, in ritual, and lower class are using it for social reasons and religious reasons. But there's also this medical use. And well, let me start finding out what they're using it for. And so he did experiments both in animals and in medical students that he was having there, and then ultimately in human subjects. So this was his first sort of modern systematic study of cannabis in the 1830s. And he found out that he had a patient with strabismus, like severe from tetanus and lockjaw, and that he could give them this cannabis extract and that their muscle tone would relax. He had severe convulsions in a patient from rabies, bite. That ultimately you get the neurological manifestations when it gets into your CNS, and you get seizures. And he was able to quiet those seizures as well. There's a few cases that he kind of describes in detail. There's somebody who's also like stiff like this, like some kind of stiff man. I don't know if it's a stiff man syndrome or I don't know what it was, but he was also able to get that patient to come out of a stiffened posture with the way he gave this cannabis is he obtained it in the streets, in the shops, because it wasn't illegal or anything. It was just, and he described in detail how it was extracted out. The resin from the flowers is extracted into some kind of oil or alcohol or butter, and that was what he was giving to these patients, a few drops, and he would measure the drops out and dose it. So he was very excited about this because, I guess it was also another way to make his career, because people would go out to the far reaches of the world in those days and say, well, now I've discovered a new treatment, and I'm going to tell all my fine British colleagues in the Royal Academies, and I'll make my name, and we've discovered a new thing from the. And he was open to. He was also the first one that said we need to have teaching in both languages, the native language and English. So he was broad-minded, it seems. He ultimately brought his brother down with him too, and this paper was like a big deal, and it was published in the Medical and Physical Proceedings of Bengal Medical Society, and then it was republished in several other journals, and it made its way across the world into Western medicine in Europe and the United States. And he wasn't done, by the way. After this, he laid all the telegraph lines in India. He shifted into something else, and he was knighted by the Queen. So this is the history of the medical use of cannabis. Okay, it's not like that's where the modern history begins, and it's now where are we relative to that now? Okay, well, what happened was after his knowledge was published, the United States Pharmacopoeia, the official book of medicines, published an entry on cannabis, and it was available in pharmacies for 100 years in the United States, from 1850 until 1942. So in that 100-year period, what we weren't able to do successfully is develop our own cannabis production system in the United States. We were kept importing it from other countries, and it would break down. Apparently it was, I think Mozambique was one country they also made it from, but mostly from India. And somehow with the alcohol extractions and light exposure, they didn't know how strong things were, and it was kind of hard to kind of get the dosing right. But that doesn't mean to say that people weren't getting treated by it. The New York Neurological Society in the early part of the 20th century said that it was one of the most superior. The president of that society, his name was Dr. Seguin. He was at Columbia, and he said it was the best treatment for migraine headaches. That was republished by William Osler in his first textbook of internal medicine. So it was not like this drug that was out of use. It was being used by the most elite members of the medical academies in the United States. The use of the drug was popular specifically for pain conditions, neurological disorders. The royal physician to Queen Victoria, he wrote about its use in menstrual cramps. And some people think that he gave it to Queen Victoria, who apparently had really severe menorrhagia and dysmenorrhea. So we don't exactly know if that actually happened, but it's possible because it was used for that. Her top doctor wrote about it, and maybe he gave it to her. So New York State had about 50 different dispensers of cannabis medicines, all up and down in the lower part of Manhattan, Long Island City, upstate. You name it. There's a book website you can go to called antiquecannabisbook.com, and you'll click on New York, and you'll see a list and the addresses of all of these manufacturers and producers of cannabis medicine. Some of them were just importing it, and then there was an attempt in Michigan to produce a cannabis supply domestically, and they called it Cannabis Americana, and that was run by Park Davis, which is a pharmaceutical company that's not as well known nowadays, but all the big companies were involved in this. Eli Lilly, Merck, Park Davis, other companies that have been absorbed and changed names today were there. So, okay, what happened? So this is all there. So basically 70, 80 years ago, people, Americans' traits of racism and greed and ignorance and all the usual stuff kind of got involved and decided that this was something they had to get rid of because, Well, there was a bunch of black jazz musicians in Harlem using this drug. And actually in Harlem, there was quite a bit of places where you could buy cannabis and use it in tea pads, they called them, on top of buildings. Jazz music was played there and whatever. And this was during alcohol prohibition when there wasn't, readily available alcohol. So it was a popular thing in the city. Basically, the guy who ran the campaign, like, literally was very racist. He said things like, giving reefers to darkies will make them think that they are as good as white men. Like, this was like somebody who was paid by the U.S. government. He was an employee of the Department of Treasury. So, some people think there was another ulterior motive, that he wanted to ban the plant because of domestic industrial production from the stalk. The cannabis plant makes those flowers we talked about with the resin, but there's also a stalk that can grow very tall, and you can make cellulose and fiber products from it. And it's possible that people were worried that as this became more industrialized, as you know, there's a Hempstead, New York, so hemp has been part of American culture, but it's been very hard to produce because you had to separate the stalk, the fiber from the cellulose in the stalk, and it was like back-breaking labor. In the South, they employed slaves to do it prior to the Civil War, and especially in Kentucky. But then a Frenchman had invented a device to make it much more like industrial, like kind of a Henry Ford model. And there was a big article published in Popular Mechanics in 1938 called $1 Billion Crop, that basically said, okay, now that we got these technology, this is going to be like revolutionize plastics and paper and thousands of different things. So people thought maybe Anslinger was getting his orders from people who were the bankers of petrochemicals. I don't know. We don't have the evidence, but there was sort of that possible ulterior motive. And then the racist motive obviously was there. You know what Jim Crow was like in this country. So Mexicans also were coming across the border using cannabis. What happened was, why did Mexicans have cannabis in the first place? Actually, there was one theory is that the Indians introduced cannabis to the West Indies in the 1840s when they were brought over to work in the sugarcane plantations, like Indians like my complexion. They, as you know, cannabis was part of their culture, so it's possible it spread from Trinidad, from Guyana, all the way up to Mexico. Also, the Spaniards, when they colonized Mexico, brought cannabis to grow the hemp for their sails and rigging, because everybody knows about the Spanish Armada, right? It was the most powerful shipping military force, and they needed to grow it there too, but it didn't take too well for their fiber production. Anyway, so that's how maybe the Mexican migrants who came across the border in the 20th century after the Spanish-American War were using it. And then throughout the border states like El Paso, Texas, they just started banning it to control the Mexican population. So racism against Mexicans, racism against Indians, racism against African Americans, potential industrial interests, they sort of conspired to put an end to cannabis as a potential future drug, and they imposed a very strong tax on the drug in 1937 in the Congress, and the AMA testified against it, saying that this would stop future research and medical development for the plant, and they said also that it would take away a really useful use of the drug that we have right now. And does anybody know what the AMA said in 1937 was the useful use of cannabis that they did not want the government to take away? It's psychotherapy. It was psychotherapy. It was to revive hidden or forgotten memories. I'm not making this up. Look in your congressional record. It's there. There was reports filed about this. It turns out in France they were doing research in the early 1920s, early part of the 20th century, on the use of cannabis as a psychotherapeutic agent. This is after the French had gone into Egypt in the Napoleonic conquest and found cannabis there, and they brought it back, and all the literary gurus like Baudelaire, Gautier, Rimbaud, all these like French names that you may have read in your French lit classes or whatever, were using cannabis in a circle. And there was a psychiatrist who's a part of that group as well. So he started writing, getting interested in this, and he had some students that were studying it. And the AMA was aware of this, and maybe they were using it in psychotherapy in the US, and they said, wow, there's nothing like this to relax the patient and get them to remember their old horrific childhood memories or whatever it might be. So, but I guess, like it is back then and now, people don't have as much appreciation for mental health. And, so, we'll get over that. We don't need people to remember their forgotten memories, whatever it might have been, and which is it's a sad truth. But that's what happened. And after that law passed, 1942, cannabis was removed from the U.S. pharmacopoeia. Because it was very difficult to obtain any cannabis from pharmacies now, and and what happened was New York City, our own lovable city here, we decided to commission a study by the New York Academy of Medicine. LaGuardia did, the mayor, to find out really if all this stuff the federal government was saying about marijuana was true. So they took prisoners from the island that's in the East River that has a prison on it. Which one? I think it was Rikers. Maybe it was named something else back then. You can ask the prison health speaker about this, because this was in the days before you had IRBs to protect prisoners from research. So unfortunately they didn't do that, but they did get cannabis from the federal supply, and they gave it to prisoners and did research, the scientists at the New York Academy of Medicine, to study whether it caused homicidal mania, whether it caused degeneration of your personality, whether it caused violence, whether it had severe addiction, all the things that the government had said, in the lead up to the law. And lo and behold, the governor, the commissioner's report, the mayor's report found that it didn't have these things. And they also wrote about the Harlem cannabis tea pads. So it's a really interesting report, 1944. We should be very proud of it. The next major report to come out about marijuana from the city of New York was last year, the New York City Comptroller's report, which I recommend you looking at, because I was involved in helping write some of it, and we were able to do some calculations and say if we had a medical marijuana law in this city, we could potentially treat 100,000 people. Like if you looked at the conditions that it was used in other states for. So that was the next major report. So basically there was this huge void from the 40s to 2013, unfortunately. But that's what sort of what happened. And after the city of New York published this report, the federal government suppressed its publication. So look at that. If you're a New Yorker, you should be angry that our hard-earned, this high city tax to live in New York, and then we get this report done, and then the government decides not even to let us publish it, and they threaten the people who wrote the articles in it. They published preliminary findings in medical journals, and it was a big mess. So basically, McCarthyism, and we don't want to talk about that. We're done with that, and that's sort of where we have been, and we are still there. At the federal level. So what people have done is they've tried to kind of find a way to bring this back after the discovery of the endocannabinoid signaling system, after the discovery that this drug can help patients who have nausea and vomiting and chemotherapy, after the discovery that it can help people with intraocular pressure, acute angle glaucoma. People started trying to find a way, let's get around this. And by the way, the whole nausea, vomiting, and the intraocular pressure, if you don't know why that works, you just have to study the endocannabinoid system, and you'll find out there's endocannabinoid receptors in the neurons that innervate the trabecular mesh between the anterior and posterior chambers of the eye. So they can relax those muscles and allow ciliary flow. And in the brainstem, in the emesis circuit, the nucleus solitarius, you have cannabinoid receptors. So we didn't even know this in the 70s and 80s when all these laws started being passed. We know it now, but you can just it makes sense when you understand the science of it. So anyway, what happened was there was a guy in Rutgers University, a professor who was going blind from his glaucoma. His name was Robert Randall. He sued the federal government because he found out that cannabis could help his vision. He smoked it one day, and then his eye pressures got better. He saw color vision for the first time. He'd been black and white for a while. And he was very impressed by this, so he started using it, cultivating it. And then he went on vacation one day, and he came home to his Jersey apartment, and there was like a letter from a cop that said, please report to the police station. You're under arrest or something. It's an unusual way to arrest somebody, but that's what he's written up. So he was very upset about this. So he did some research and found out that the federal government had actually, basically done research at UCLA. They had done clinical trials of smoked cannabis in glaucoma patients using a tonometer or tachometer. There's a device that you can use where you put it on the eye and you can measure the pressure in the chamber. It's like pushes against it, pushes it back, and you can get these objective readings. So you can do that with two groups of glaucoma patients. You have placebo and active cannabis, and you can find out that the pressure goes down. And so the government already knew that in the early 70s and had published in journals, and there was a few other research studies. And here's this guy, 1977, getting arrested for using it for that purpose. So he sued the government in federal court and won, on the medical necessity grounds. That, I'm going blind here, and you guys know about this. And so the federal judge forced the government to open up an investigational new drug program, quote unquote, as if cannabis was new. But, that's what the government sort of insists. It's way older than the FDA, as you know from the talk I'm giving you. But that was the terms they used under Carter administration, and they opened up this program and started supplying cannabis to patients. Limited number. Some states got involved in the game and decided, hey, we should pass our own laws as well, because that'll make it easier for the patients to go through the paperwork. So 36 states did that in the early 80s and late 70s. New York was one of them. And only about 7 states from those 36 actually implemented this law. New York was one of them. So we had, in the 1980s, from about 1980 to 1985, 5 New York State hospitals. I think in New York City it was just what was called Columbia Memorial Hospital, which is now, I think, Memorial Sloan Kettering, at the time had applied for this. Also Long Island, it wasn't even called LIJ at the time, like whatever it was called back then. Okay, that hospital also had cannabis cigarettes available for patients. They gave it to patients who had chemotherapy-induced nausea and vomiting, what we would today call palliative care. And 95% in some of the reports, relief. This was open label study. But they collected data. They actually collected data on all these. I think they got 8,000 cannabis cigarettes from the federal supply and gave it to these hospitals. And several hundred patients benefited. About 100 practitioners participated. Medical doctors. Maybe there were some medical students on the wards as well, like you guys will be next year. So that's what happened in this state. What did the federal government do when all these states were doing these programs and we were finding all these benefits? They shut them down. Because they wanted, again, the old greed, racism, and control issues still hadn't abated. And they said, well, you know what? If there is something medically useful here, let's just make it into a pill. And, that way you don't have a plant to grow and all that other stuff that we just can't deal with because it's so organic, or I don't even know if that term was in circulation back then. But, that's the idea. That's essentially what happened. The government, through the mid-'80s, up until 1985, was fast-tracking the development of THC pills. It's called Marinol in the trade name, but it's really a THC pill. That's like saying that coffee is basically a caffeine molecule, which, if you've ever had different varieties of coffee, there's different terpenoids in there, and there's aroma, and there's roast, and there's other things, and maybe even the antioxidants in coffee are what improve the memory and other things over the long term, not the caffeine. In the same way with cannabis, marijuana, it's not just THC, tetrahydrocannabinol, which was discovered in 1964, the actual chemical structure. There are maybe 80 other cannabinoids, a most important secondary one called CBD, cannabidiol, which is like anti-THC. It has like antipsychotic properties. It blunts the anxiogenic effects of THC, anti-seizure activity. It's a really interesting compound. And then, in addition to the cannabinoid class that I told you about that the plant developed to stop the UV radiation from bothering its DNA, also there are terpenoids, flavonoids, sesquiterpenoids, phytosterols. These are things normally found in plants. Like, so if you're interested in integrative medicine or herbal medicine, you might have heard about things like limonene. Limonene is found in limes. It's what gives limes the limony smell. Cannabis makes limonene, and limonene improves blood flow to the brain and has some positive like mood properties. Pinene, which is pine trees make pinene. You go out into nature on a hike and it smells really good. And there's data that shows that hikes make people's mental health better. Maybe it's because you're smelling pinene, which we know improves mood and again cerebral blood flow and a bunch of other things. These are all published in complementary alternative medicine journals. You can see this stuff. So it's not just THC, and it's possible that there's a synergistic effect. That's what people think between cannabinoids plus the other compounds that are found in the plant that maybe make the mesh. So instead of the silver bullet or silver bullet approach, where it's just like one compound, I've hit that receptor, I've blocked your adrenergic receptor, now your blood pressure should go down. It's called the synergistic shotgun. I've got several compounds going here. This is sort of the lead effect, and these things will help to support that and make it more tolerable, because just a pure molecule will give you a really bad headache or really bad anxiety or really bad this. But if I mix it together with these other things, it seems to work better. So that's what people prefer. So the theory that the government had that Marinol THC pills would take care of marijuana, that's why it failed. If it was the same thing, presumably, okay, let's make this available everywhere, end of story. It was actually what happened. The real reason why they were doing this so quickly is because there was federal hearings going on in Washington, D.C. at that time, where they were trying to decide whether they should reschedule marijuana. Reschedule is an important term because when I was in medical school, like you guys, I was in my second year lectures, I was reading about psychiatry, mental health lectures, and they said Schedule 1, and in a pharmacology lecture, Schedule 1 drugs have no currently accepted medical use and treatment, high potential for abuse, and no accepted standard for safety for use under medical supervision. And there sat marijuana. I was like, wow, that's why is that? That seems unreasonable. And essentially, that's still the official position of the government, and people filed a petition to change that in 1972 when they officially put that in 70. And that petition finally got its day in court in 1986. So it took that many years. That's sort of how interested they are in changing this. So around that same time, the federal government wanted to come to those hearings saying, oh, yeah, we took care of this problem. We got Marinol pills, don't worry. Despite that, the federal judge, the DEA judge, ruled based on like 2 years of testimony. Remember, this is before anybody even knew the word endocannabinoid. Okay, there was no literature. About 1988 was the one that was first published, 1989, I think. So he said that cannabis should be rescheduled to Schedule 2, like cocaine and morphine, which is where those two drugs are, like other anesthetics and painkillers. And to not do so would be unreasonable, arbitrary, and capricious. That was the quote from the judge's ruling, and the DEA head ignored it, and the federal government ignored it, because they were in the middle of a drug war. So essentially, that's where we are now. It's a science versus politics, and of course, the people that get most impacted are vulnerable patients who they're sick right now, they need help, and they don't have the time to file petitions and go to hearings and do whatever they need something right now. So what did people do after the government sort of decided that it wasn't a fair partner? And New York did this program, and instead of like, okay, now we should make medical marijuana available, cannabis available to all the hospitals in New York, well, we got THC pills instead. So several of the other states that have these state programs going in the 90s or in the early 2000s passed their own medical marijuana laws. Their own laws were like, you know what, forget you feds and your federal supply, we'll just produce it ourselves here, we'll give licensed doctors in our state the ability to authorize select patients to use it, and we'll just take care of it ourselves, we'll just cut you out. So that's what the states have done, and that's what we'd like to do in New York as well. The first state to do this was in 1996, was California, and it had the most liberal law. Any condition for which marijuana provides relief was written in the law. And the guy who wrote that into the law was a physician, actually, a psychiatrist named Todd McCrea, and he was the one that discovered all the old research of Dr. O'Shaughnessy that I was telling you about earlier. So, he was really like dedicated to this thing. And he believed that there was many other conditions that really like menstrual cramps. Who's going to say marijuana is okay for menstrual cramps? When menstrual cramps can be very debilitating, and I have to take an NSAID for that, which can damage my kidneys and cause GI problems. When why not be able to use cannabis? That's the kind of thing that was why he had the foresight. And then not to mention mental health conditions, right? Everybody thinks that the way these laws were passed was showing the public that really critically ill, terminally ill patients with HIV, cancer, wasting syndromes were actively dying and needed relief. But here's somebody with severe depression. They look this. Maybe they're smiling, or maybe they're not looking. People aren't going to buy that as seeing sick enough. So people wouldn't have given them an exemption. So he created that exemption to allow all conditions. And that's the problem with the California law, is that they did not allow any kind of implementation regulation. It was like, hey, look, we don't know where you're going to get it. We don't know how you're going to produce it. Just you're okay to get it if you can get it. It was only many years later with these other laws. New Mexico was the first one to start licensing dispensing. So that's now we have 20 states plus the District of Columbia that have these kind of laws in place. Three of the states besides New York that have these cannabis to cancer patients programs in the 80s have passed these laws. That's Vermont, Michigan, New Mexico, actually 4, and California. All those 4 states were like New York in the 80s and had these programs and have gone on to do something more comprehensive. So if you saw the news recently, what Governor Cuomo is now saying is, let's open up that old 80s program. And that essentially, that's not a medical cannabis program. Let's just sort of get the supply from the federal government like we did all those years ago. It turns out that there's really no need for an executive action to do that kind of thing. Columbia, just a few years ago, was doing research on HIV/AIDS patients and found out that if you give them cannabis cigarettes, which they got from the federal supply under a license, and they had real patients with HIV, and you give them cannabis versus placebo cigarettes, and you give them a room full of food, like maybe we'll have food here in a little bit, and if you keep them in the hospital for like a month, that and they're having problems keeping their weight up, the patients who receive the cannabis versus the placebo end up with more weight at the end of the month. So they've done controlled, randomized clinical trials in New York with cannabis supplies, and the Governor Cuomo didn't have anything to do with that, right? The point is that you don't need federal or state level action to get federal supply cannabis to do research. It's just really hard to do. A lot of paperwork, a lot of bureaucracy. So that's kind of where we are in the state right now with the politics. And the website that I'd recommend you guys to check out, is this group called New York Physicians for Compassionate Care. So this is we have about 600 MDs and DOs in the state that have sort of said that we need to, or 650 I think the number is now, who've said that we need to support, pass a law which allows doctors to be able to recommend this, and for seriously ill patients shouldn't be criminalized for using it if the physician recommends that it might be useful. And this is what we have to do to work around the federal political machine. And if you go to this site and click Get Involved, put your name in, you can consider yourselves healthcare providers, because that's what you'll be doing next year as a clinical clerk on third year on the wards. You are providing health care to the patients. They see you as doctors. You're wearing the white coat. Maybe you're going into the hospital right now and interviewing patients. They see you as a doctor. So you are a healthcare provider of some sort. And that'll really help us to show that there is support in the medical communities. In the New York group of doctors, we get the science, we get the humanitarian issue, and we'd really like our state to have a program. I've worked in those kind of programs. I've done research. You can look at some of my articles. My website is www.cannabinergy.com. Cannabinergy is like serotonergy or dopaminergy. It's what it is. And you can see our press conference with the comptroller. That's this little video I have there, which we have this report that the city of, they took it down. Okay, well, Because the new comptroller took over, so maybe they've archived it or something, but it's still filed with the city. Just Google New York City Comptroller report. I'll have to update that link, but that must have expired after de Blasio's administration took over. But that report is really good, and it kind of imagines how we would have this in New York City. HHC hospitals could produce marijuana on their roofs. They talk about that, and they do a calculation with all the different conditions. We're talking everything from seizure disorders, chronic pain syndromes, wasting syndromes, inflammatory bowel diseases, hepatitis C, neurological disorders like multiple sclerosis. There's data that suggests that you can even slow disease progression in MS if you have cannabis medicines on board. The data is very exciting, and you can look at my library here, and I've got some articles there that you can look at. Okay, so I'm running out of time here, and I want to leave enough time for questions. So let me stop there.
So, is it being advocated for cancer patients as a way to introduce it to being used more broadly, or is it does it specifically help nausea from chemo, but not other nausea?
Oh no, it works in several different kinds of nausea. There's, it just happened that it was discovered in that setting in the 70s. People were getting, there was new chemo drugs that were introduced in the 70s that were strong, had really severe. Chemo is rather new. It's not it doesn't go far back. It's the 70s that most chemo drugs were developed. And even many more since then. So it just sort of happened that this was a setting that people got severe nausea. People get nausea and vomiting also from taking their HIV meds, in those days HAART. And there's been research, a guy named Dennis Israelski at Stanford University published an article that there was 3 to 4 times greater adherence to ART, antiretroviral regimen, for the patients using cannabis who had HIV versus those not using. And if you interview those patients, you find out, because it helps me with my stomach, it helps me keep it down. So it's beyond that. I mean, and in the cancer setting, it started out with this palliative thing, but it turns out if you go to the National Cancer Institute website, they have a summary that even talks about the fact that so benefits include antiemetic, appetite, pain relief, improved sleep, but then they're also talking about the fact that there are cancer-killing properties of cannabinoids, and that is really exciting. The fact that it can prevent stimulate apoptosis of carcinogenic cells, stop spread. See this? You can read this is NIH. This is federally funded, so it's not just this sort of one-off. Breast cancer, prostate. There's been one trial in humans with THC injection directly into a glioblastoma multiforme. So check it out. It's very exciting. Cannabinoid. A lot of metastatic cells end up producing cannabinoid receptors on their cells. Remember, the immune system is constantly killing tumors, right? If you don't have a good immune system, you get cancer, and that's one of the things that you can get in addition to opportunistic infections. So, yeah.
What are the side effects of smoking cannabis?
You tell me.
I was hoping you would tell me.
Yeah, no, of course. It's such a widespread use in the culture, so most people know that, okay, if I use too much THC, I can have an anxiogenic effect. I can have a short-term memory interruption. I can have palpitations. I can have dry mouth, those kind of things. But all of those things can be modulated, mitigated. If you have more CBD in the cannabis, you mitigate some of the anxiogenic effects, some of the memory issues, and also from chronic use that people see that those effects are mitigated as well. So it's like, but so those.
What about respiratory effects?
Right. So the data. This guy has done the largest epidemiological studies, and. American Thoracic Society. He's a pulmonologist at UCLA. No clear link to COPD has been established, and then later he says no clear link to cancer, lung cancer, aerodigestive tract cancer have been established. Soot, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons are there, and that can produce bronchitis, chronic use of smoking. That's why medically you should recommend your patients to use vaporizers, which are non-smoked inhaled delivery methods. why do we use inhalation anyway? Why don't we just give it as an IV or something? Because cannabinoids are lipophilic. They don't dissolve well in aqueous solution, so you can't give it by IV. Sorry about that. The lungs are the size of a tennis court, right? When you open up all the alveoli. So it's a really wide, you get quick, rapid titration of dose and that kind of thing. Goes right into your carotids, into the brain nervous system, and there you go. So that's the issue there. Then there's a GI, you can avoid the lungs altogether with GI in absorption with extracts like O'Shaughnessy was studying in those days. And there's a spray that's being developed by a pharmaceutical company which goes under the tongue, but you also swallow it as well. So you have sublingual and duodenal absorption. So those are the different modes of administration. There's also topical use that people have used for centuries as well. And there are cannabinoid receptors in the skin. So that's you can look that up on PubMed as well. There was somebody else over here who had a hand, I think. I didn't want to. There you are. Yeah.
So you made a compelling argument for medical marijuana. What are your thoughts on recreational?
Yeah, I mean, like in the Indian context is where the idea that this is sort of an untested, like we've never done that before, it's just false. And I mean, I just know that there are countries and cultures that have integrated cannabis responsibly into their society, and they're doing fine. And that was like the Indian. They had dispensers for religious use, for just social use. It was used in weddings and that kind of thing for a long time. So it doesn't mean that humans can't get along, and we don't turn into like torporous, unachieving, whatever. That's the theory. And then there's been anthropological studies in Jamaica, Greece, and Costa Rica of long-term. Also, there's long-term cannabis use there too. The Jamaicans in the 70s studies, there was a woman from New York here who went down there and studied them under federal money, found out that they worked better. Like they used cannabis to do hard labor, like in the fields. So there's, as opposed to, I think there's a lot of confusion with like, okay, well, I'm using this in the basement and it's dark and nobody can see me, but is maybe you're using it in the basement in the dark and on the couch because you don't want to be seen. Because if you're seen, then when you criminalize things, you promote the most sort of risky way to use them. So the public health argument is to make cannabis available in a regulated, safe fashion for a proper age group, and life goes on. I think that's the way. And issues that do develop, you deal with them with education. And like tobacco, the deaths from smoking have gone down. Like there was just a CDC report that came out. I can't remember how many 100,000 deaths we've prevented. Just when nobody had to go to jail, nobody had 3 mandatory minimum prison sentences in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, for making a tobacco field, because that's literally what we're doing with marijuana. So that's you shift it from the criminal truly to the public health, and that's not saying everybody is an addict because they're using. There's a sort of a middle ground people that are saying, let's just sort of, instead of criminalize everybody, let's pathologize everybody, right? And there are people who are going to have problems with cannabis. It's not good for everybody. People who have severe side effects, the cannabinoid receptors, or mental illness, family history of mental illness, they should be used with caution. So people are going to have problems, but the way you address them is through sort of a legal, regulated system. And I think cannabis can be safely integrated into society as a recreational, social. I prefer the word sort of social, because people are using it for things that are not just like, okay, what is recreation? Boating, or canoe, or is it appreciating art? The Dr. Grinspoon at Harvard, he's an emeritus professor. He calls it enhancement as a use of cannabis too. So I don't know if we're there as a state, but all of that stuff, we will get there. But if we can't deal with like people who are like critically ill, then we're never going to get anywhere. We're gonna continue to treat it like a plutonium. You didn't have a question before. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you see a full-scale legalization for recreational use as has happened in Washington, Colorado, happening anytime soon in New York?
That's what I'm saying. I don't see that. What's happened is the reason why Washington, Colorado especially was able to do this is because they had a medical cannabis regulated program for 12 years. People were used to it. They understand, okay, this is around, my grandma's using it, great-grandpa's using it, my kid with Dravet syndrome, severe seizures is using it, and, we're still making our football team is doing well this year, or whatever it is, whatever you might think would happen,
Do you think that those states could serve as some sort of precedent to make it maybe occur? I mean, I don't know.
I hope so. Yeah. I mean, I think this is a social change happens very slowly, and I would wish the federal government would do something too. I mean, what's the state by state thing? I mean, it's not like all of a sudden it's not medicinally useful when one state says it is and another isn't. It's just it's extremely illogical, and I think that, the more radical thing is the medical thing. It turns out I think the feds are willing to. We'll see. I mean, there's still a lot of people in jail, and all of the stop and frisk and all the arrests and all of this goes on much more significantly in socioeconomically poorer groups and black and brown groups. They get the brunt of this because policing is part of the daily life, whereas if you're in the suburbs, you're much more encapsulated from that. So it really does need to be addressed. I'm hoping that we're sort of moving in this direction of just stopping this whole criminalization approach. And that's why you need to have the cultural, social, historical stuff to really understand how this is a normal part of a human relationship and not this thing that you're just going to cordon off, right? That's why I talked about all that. Okay, so please email me, pick up a card, and go to the website, Compassionate Care, and please help support us, okay?
Thank you so much, everyone, for listening, and thank you, Sunil, for coming up and giving a great talk. I'd like to thank the other lead organizers, Becca Mon, Sarah Ruberman, and Kyle Whelan, and the lecture organizer, Rachel Harold, as well as all of our other organizers and participants. We'd also like to thank our faculty advisor, Matt Anderson, as well as Marty Grayson, Albert Kuverman, and Martin Penn. There are much more lectures to come, so please subscribe and stay tuned. And thank you all once again for listening. And always remember, imagination is more important than knowledge. Peace.